It's wonderful to be here with you all, and thank you for taking the time to join us for this conversation. I'd also like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the unceded land on which I'm working today, the Wadawurrung people, and acknowledge elders past, present, and future. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional lands of the land that you're on, and any First Nations people who are joining us for this roundtable. As the head of democracy and diplomacy here at the MAV and the director of urban analytics at the ANU Institute for Infrastructure in Society, AI is a constant and looming influence in my work and my life, both for its extraordinary opportunities and the misuse. AI is transforming every aspect of life and business, and local government is no exception. It offers enhanced efficiencies and streamlining of processes, and advanced specialised capabilities of analysis and interconnection of processes in complex environments. It can help detect patterns, predict or formulate alternative options or futures, and identify risks and opportunities. It can extend our capabilities in ways beyond our imaginations. But then there are the issues, the environmental impacts of AI, especially LLM's huge energy and water consumption, the bias and gendered harms caused by some AI tools, the questions of copyright and intellectual property and Indigenous data sovereignty, and the rapidly escalating capacities for disinformation, from deepfakes to bots to entirely fabricated scientific reports that are increasingly difficult for the average reader or policymakers to distinguish. While some councils are already harnessing AI to deliver smarter, more responsive services, others are understandably cautious, reflecting community concerns and questions. Used ethically and with care, AI offers powerful opportunities to benefit both local governments and the communities they serve. And so I'm delighted that you can join us today for this very timely discussion about AI in local government, discovering some real-world uses and untapped opportunities, how we bring communities along the AI journey and learn how to engage, educate, and build trust with your constituents, and how we combat misinformation and disinformation in the age of AI, equipping yourself with the latest strategies to protect your community from false narratives. Our speaker today a writer, activist, and broadcaster and columnist with The Guardian. We have Bonnie Shaw, Chief Innovator in Residence here at Municipal Association of Victoria. And we have Harman Singh, who specialises in smart cities and places at GHD. We're going to start with a few questions and discussion amongst our panellists, and then I'll open it up to questions from the floor. If you'd like to put them in the chat at any time, please do. Please do include your name and company before your question. But first, to our speakers. My first question to you, all of you, is AI is rapidly changing how governments operate and engage with their communities. How do you see AI reshaping the role of local government in the next 5 years? And I'm going to start with Bonnie Shaw.
Thanks very much, Ika. I knew you were going to throw to me first. Hi, everyone. It's an absolute pleasure to be here and alongside some wonderful colleagues. How is AI changing how governments operate and engage with their communities is a topic that we are exploring in the MAV Lab every day. So the MAV Lab is an innovation lab established about 12 months ago by the MAV to serve all 79 local governments across the state of Victoria. And one of the areas that we focus on is service innovation and technology, with a particular focus on AI. And we've just conducted a pretty significant project looking at the role of AI in the statutory planning process. And so I can with some insight drawn from a consultation process with about 250 people across local government and the sector. And I think there's two, I might speak to two ways that I think are some of the most significant. The first is kind of internally in local government operations. This is the stuff that I think is going to be somewhat hidden. And it's around process optimization and service optimization. I'm really excited about opportunities around cutting down processing time and administrative tasks, and the use of automation and AI and various forms of AI to support around compliance, around document checking, around validation of information, to take some of that administrative burden off of council staff to allow them to focus on more higher order cognitive tasks. The other area where I think we're going to see some really significant change, and I think we as a sector really need to tread very carefully, is around how we engage with community. And I think there's a couple of different ways this can go. I think these technologies are sort of finding a footing at a time where we're seeing a decline in public participation, where we're seeing some of the social fabric that we kind of take for granted start to fray. And there's a pretty significant challenge that these technologies accelerate those processes. And so I think there's some pretty interesting ethical and functional challenges that we really need to grapple with as a sector, with how we engage with these technologies in a way that is participatory and collaborative with community.
Thank you. Following on from that, Van, do you have some comments from your experience to add? Sorry, your microphone is still muted.
I'm always that person. Hello, everybody. I'm on the lands of the Turrbal and Yagara people today up in Brisbane because I'm attending the Something Digital conference. We can imagine this is a very live issue. And I think that we have to accept that there are massive risks involved in the sort of gold rush mentality around AI at the moment, where a lot of organisations, public or private, are rushing towards implementation, not wanting to be left behind, but without actually instituting any guardrails, presuming that they already exist. Well, I just want to remind everybody that when we let corporations and profit-seeking operations determine how tools will function, we end up with things like Boeing planes falling out of the sky, nuclear disasters, the poisoning of rivers, toxic leaks, exposure to dangerous chemicals like asbestos. We look at financial implications like the GFC, the savings and loan crisis in the United States, everything Australians learned about the banking system through the Banking Royal Commission. We cannot expect platforms that operate in a private space that are informed by the profit motive of private business to regulate themselves beyond their capacity to make money. Now, I'm not begrudging a corporation seeking to make profit and be sustainable. That is their function. But as service providers in a public space, there are structural questions about the implementation of the platforms that have to address the fact that we're essentially at cross purposes. And importing it by use has pretty serious implications about public service provision. And I'm looking particularly at what we're seeing in terms of organisations that are meeting key performance indicators around efficiency, outputs, budget pressure, looking to use AI to replace human staff. That can be disastrous. In the situation recently, the Commonwealth Bank fired 45 employees in order to introduce an AI-powered voice bot, which actually required greater labour at the Commonwealth Bank end, where the technology did not work, was not fit for purpose in terms of meeting the goals that they had been told it would make. And you had a situation where the CBA had to rehire 45 people to replace the roles that they just outsourced. Now, budgetary pressure is a terrible reason for introducing these kind of tools. We also have the implications of the bias that's built into these systems. Like ChatGPT, which I use every day, it's an incredibly helpful tool, is an instrument of bias for bias. If you suck up the text and knowledge of a world that has structural biases and repackages it, as a communication tool, you repackage those biases, especially if you're trying to use AI around accessibility, you're actually strengthening the restrictions and the narrowing of access that keeps people out of systems effectively. Another really good example is that 5 years ago, Amazon, one of the biggest, most profitable corporations in the world, decided that they would create an efficiency within their system of staff assessment. And they used their inherited data from all the years of existence to profile their ideal candidates. Well, of course, there's sexist bias at Amazon because it has a sexist bias, particularly around employment in technology roles. And the AI replicated the data in hiring decisions to the point where it was deliberately excluding from consideration any CV through its AI portal that made any reference to the applicant being female. But serious considerations when we look at this enthusiasm for efficiency, that we're looking at professionalised models that replicate biases, that make pattern predictions based on what has already happened. And the thing is that AI uses a set that it is inherited from the past to make decisions about the future. And yet the future is not located in what has just happened. In terms of, especially if we're talking about local governance, that exists as a mechanism to access the services they need to make communities functional. AI removed from the loop, and the issue of appropriate data sets are used to inform decision making. And I want to make this point as well. We have seen, specifically in the Victorian local context, years of sustained harassment and targeting of councils and council employees from extremist groups who are trying to push disinformation and conspiratorial narratives in the community. And we've seen disturbing incidents like the bomb threats and death threats that were levelled at library staff at Monash Council and others around things like Drag Queen Story Hour, with people becoming subject to these disinformation campaigns that target human cost. AI scales and supercharges and the political campaigning to make systems platforms to enable and mass harassment of organisations and employees is a really serious risk that we have to build into our understanding. Government organisations can be targeted and affected to
there's a very significant. There's also the singular notion of how we collectively and what I lump it all into one idea of technology that will solve. I won't have any of them. Some different perspectives. What are your thoughts on this particular issue?
So the role of AI in local governments, and well, I think Bonnie and Juan really put it out really well. So I was going to say, for me, I'm completely convinced that AI is transformative. It has a huge potential, like Bonnie was sharing some of those examples of what it could do to above the house operations, day-to-day activities in the council in terms of productivity improvements, but also the front of the house. How do we serve our communities better, and how do we get our citizens in the journey? So that's the transformative potential. But I also feel like AI is no doubt, it comes with its own challenge. And Juan really pointed out some of those, whether it's the bias, whether it's the ability for it to supersede humans in the loop. So how do we kind of not my personal perception about AI, and we're still in its early days, who knows in which direction we're going to go. But I use this concept of protopia. I heard it from one of the famous authors, Tracy. And Tracy wrote a book called It's all about AI in government, and she came up with this term called protopia. And basically, it's a combination of two terms. She said, as humans, when we don't know anything about what kind of impact something is going to have on us, we end up going into one of these two extremes, either a utopian version of it, like AI is going to be the solution to all of world's problem, or a dystopian version of it. Oh my God, it's going to overrule humanity and it's going to be a disaster. But majority of the times, it's neither of those two extremes. It's going to be something in the middle where AI will end up actually solving some of the real big problems that we have today. At the same time, does not overrun humanity, does not take out the human in the loop. So it's kind of somewhere in the middle. And I'll just share this quick analogy in terms of how in the past, in my early days, I saw another similar disruptive technology when computers were taking over some of the industry. And my dad used to be in banking, and this is like, when I was in my early teens, there was a lot of skepticism about computers are going to take away all the jobs and all. But it wasn't really that case. If you look around, we're all using computers today. So it has become a tool that we become better. In fact, my dad actually ended up becoming a financial manager from a bank officer because he ended up learning computers really early on. So that's kind of my takeaway, is that it's going to be a protopian version of the future. It'll be somewhere in the middle, and we are better off by using AI, learning enhance the ways we go about in our day to day.
Thank you. I mean, there's so many different aspects of this. So as we talk about it around, increased capacity, the employment implications of bringing in a hugely disruptive new technology that does have many, many opportunities, also demands very robust guardrails, what the knowledge components of this might look like, what the bias might, what bias this might exacerbate by adding that biased lens over biased information that is retrospective by nature, as Van was saying. So what does this look like when we're looking at the local level? This is another question for you, Harman, to come back to you. From your experience leading smart city initiatives, what are some of the most promising real-world applications of AI in local government that council should be exploring and adopting now in this context?
Well, I had the privilege of being part of the Aussie contingent to the Smart Cities World Congress in Barcelona last year. And that's where, they bring together all these cities who set up their booths on the expo floor, and they demonstrate what so I got to understand what some of the good examples of AI that everyone else was talking about. With me, one was from a city called Tampere in Finland. So I never knew this, but they are supposedly the home of Nokia. They're like, Nokia was born in this place. I said, okay, so what are you guys doing in this little place in Finland called Tampere? And they were like, we are building a metaverse of a skills inventory. We are struggling with the we have enough people with that kind of skills and all. So we're kind of developing, and that's where we are leveraging AI to help us identify on one side what kind of skills do we have in our current communities, and on the other hand, what are the skills we need for our future, and then AI helps us mix and match those. So I was like, that's a good example. I like that. The other one was one of the cities from the Middle East, where they have the benefit and the luxury of a little bit. Let's put it this way. They talked about management, and this is where they were talking about their teams. When they go out to repair something, let's say a pumping station, there was a fault there, and this guys from the asset team go there. They have what they call an on-device LLM. So they are calling it AI. Actually guides them in terms of what seems to be the most likely problem and what would be a potential way to resolve it. And they were showing it in action. So I was like, okay, so this is real. But I would also have to share one little example from closer to home. So we in Melbourne also doing quite a lot of stuff on AI, and Bonnie alluded to it. There are different forms of AI. So there is what we call the traditional AI, which is machine learning, computer vision, some of those things that have been around for a little while. And then there is the generative AI, and also so AI is a big term, and we need to be able to see what we are doing here closer to home. So I'm going to share my screen very briefly, Ika, for just a couple of minutes. Seeing is believing. Just show what we have been doing here closer to home. So I am part of the innovation team at CEDA, Victorian Infrastructure Delivery Authority. I'm embedded there in the innovation team, and this team is tasked to actually do, bring in a lot of those innovations in terms of what's the latest and greatest happening in the parts of the world. How could we bring it over to Victoria, to Melbourne? And we have a case study that recently got published around the use of camera AI in construction. I'll actually share it with you. I'll show you what I'm saying. So this is an example of how a camera views construction activity happening at a site. Looks like it's not very clear, so I'm going to just scroll back and see if it helps this time. Oh, what is this good old Murray's law? Anything that can go wrong will go wrong. But look, here's an example of just using cameras on a site. And in this case, we were counting the number of panels that get installed on a wall to use it as a proxy of the amount of work that gets happens. So talking about productivity enhancements, what we found out was the number of or the amount of work that gets done on a particular day of the week, particular time of the day was very different. And then there were certain days where it was very low utilization, other days were very high. And we then married this information with the weather data to start being more predictive, to say, if we were to assess what would be the completion in 2 weeks' time, we realized we could do X amount of work, but then when you factor in there could be a major weather event, you realize it's not X, it's going to be less than X. So there's a chance we're going to have a schedule overrun. Construction, but at least during the time. So how do we kind of minimize the amount of disruption that construction causes is an example of where we are using AI closer to home.
Thank you. That's a great example. I think it's interesting. We look at these really great examples of where AI is being used really effectively to do things that are really critical. I mean, I was reading a report about landmine detection in Ukraine and how AI is being used now to enhance capabilities of landmine detection. I know of a startup here in Melbourne that's allowing better forecasting of cloud coverage for solar cells to better allow continuity of energy supply. But then we also see AI use in things like Notify apps and things where it's hard to find a particular social or structural benefit to any usage of that particular AI. And when we look at things like the UN Global Risk Report, which was released recently, that had 3 prongs that I thought were of real interest, that were highlighted as key global risks and they were of interest to this conversation. One being mis and disinformation, which we're now used to seeing as right at the top of all of the global risk reports. One being AI as a frontier technology, and one being technology facilitated power concentration. Those 3 operating, those 3 threads coming together to create a really, really different paradigm in which we are undertaking local governance and all forms of governance, provides us with a really complex and challenging environment. So I'd like to come to you, Van. Given your experience as a writer and activist, what are the key challenges and concerns that communities have around AI adoption in local governance, and how can these concerns be authentically addressed?
Well, the key risk in terms of local governments is a reduction in institutional trust. So it was interesting at a session I was at Something Digital Today. They were talking about how teenagers have, because they're digital natives, have an almost preternatural ability to recognise AI. Like they have picked up on the language of AI and can recognise various patterns in AI. And apparently the term that we should become familiar with is a clanker. Like a clanker is an AI-created piece of information that is obvious in its falseness. What that is doing is, of course, reducing institutional trust. We already have profound issues because of years of sustained disinformation campaigning on social media, trying to convince us that governments hate us, that democracies don't really work, that the newspapers are consistently lying to you, that no one will turn up for you in an emergency. Like these are narratives that have been deliberately seeded by exploitative corporations. We know that, who want to pick up private contracts for public services. And we also know that they're used by hostile foreign governments in order to make democracies dysfunctional. And on this last point, I've had a personal encounter with a Russian activist campaign, which has been to pollute data sources that are being used in AI. Work on this, tracing this deliberate contamination of data sources has been traced by the American Sunlight Project, which is a counter-disinformation think tank in the United States who monitors this kind of stuff. And it came up in my own PhD research where I was working on a literature review and a word had escaped me. So I turned to ChatGPT to go, I'm thinking of a word, I can't deep in the depths of thesis with 10 words that might have been sort of in the wheelhouse. And one of them I had never seen before, and it seemed to be an academic Greek word. And I was like, it's unusual that I wouldn't know that word. So I looked at it, and it's a Russian propaganda term that has been used to describe how stupid Westerners can't function properly in their use of technology, essentially, and found this ream of academic writing in English, which had obviously been pumped into ChatGPT's data banks in order to foster pro-Russian political narratives that deep into the data that we're using on a day-to-day basis. And what are the guardrails around how are prioritising information integrity when the platforms that we're using, that most of us are now downloading to our phones day by day, are not actually reliable data sources? And this is before we even get into the tendency of large language models to hallucinate, to make things up, to put together academic sources or refer to legislation or to give us an illusion of hard information to please us as users rather than to inform strict decisions. I mean, there's an absolute imperative for Australia to put in place legal frameworks where the platforms we're using are held to the same standards as employees in the public service. In Queensland, where I am at the moment, there's a very robust regulatory environment around public service ethics that govern the way decisions get made, how public servants can communicate, what their interactions with the public will look like. And these guardrails that build all of these systems. You know, it is very important that we understand at the onset stage that we program our ethics first and we program our guidelines first, and we actually place a value on important, on truthful and factual information. One of the problems we're having in this discussion at the moment in Australia is that we have bros from the in productivity conversations who don't think it's appropriate to compensate the authors of the information that is being sucked up into these large language models. And you can imagine, as a person who earns their living from writing and is aware of the fact that 5 of my books and everything I have ever published with The Guardian or The New York Times is now part of, is now being profited from ChatGPT. The idea that and Facebook and whoever else is using those particular data sets, like this has been traced. I have not been paid for my work the way that an Australian local council library pays me for my work through copyright, or acknowledges my copyright every time a book is loaned out. We have systems for attributing and valuing authorship and the integrity of information in local libraries, but corporations who are resistant to valuing and putting a premium on the sources that they use for the large language model tools. One of the things that we should be arguing is that there has to be a premium on good information, that there must be penalties for bad information, and attribution of sources has got to be interrogated at every level. And the sooner that we do that, the sooner that we proceed with models of usage that are governed by our ethics, by accountabilities, by frameworks, by information hygiene and integrity, the more problems we solve for ourselves further down the road before we make decisions informed by data sets that are compromised in any number of ways.
Thank you. There are many, many challenges associated with this. I'll pass to you, Bonnie, particularly around that theme around institutional trust and all of these things that operate in this eroded information environment that we currently operate within. How do we respond to that? How can councils effectively use AI? How are councils effectively using AI? And how can we ensure that communities understand where and how AI is being used, and particularly applying that lens of institutional trust?
Thanks, Ika. We work together a lot, so you know that this is a particular area of focus and passion for me. I talk a lot about feedback loops and flywheels, but in this case, feedback loops. And I think I'm misquoting Augustus. If anyone is a scholar in Greek philosophy, please jump in and tell me the right source of this. But I was recently part of a multi-day dialogue on AI and society, and the quote that stuck with me in that was, "We act on one another." And that feedback loop of democratic exchange. We are in dialogue with one another, we take action, and those actions then work on each other. And I think one of the major challenges with AI, particularly LLMs and these kind of relationships that people are building, is that it sort of removes and isolates people and removes them from acting on one another. You become kind of caught in these recursive feedback loops. I'm a big fan of the Marshall McLuhan quote, "First we shape our tools, then they shape us." And he's actually living on a Churchill quote when he gave a speech standing in the rubble of the Blitz in London, saying, "First we shape our buildings, thereafter we shape us." The same, I believe, can be said of our institutions. And so what I am very hopeful for about the capacity for AI and moving well beyond just large language models, but into some of the other technologies that Harman's mentioned, is the capacity for these tools to increase efficiency, productivity, and service quality in local government, so that we may deliver on the promise of these institutions. And I think one of the best to build institutional trust is to deliver on the promises that you're making. And so to provide well-provisioned, well-maintained infrastructure, to provide efficient services, to provide the capacity for responsive communications. I've been looking at the Section 18 of the Charter of Victorian Human Rights, which is the right to partake in public life. And I think that as we kind of think about the roles of AI, there's one that's very much in this kind of productivity space around the capacity for our institutions, which are under a huge amount of stress, financial stress, political kind of community stress that's coming at us in many of the reasons that examples that Van's mentioned. We're facing huge stress and challenge from climate change and the impact that's having on infrastructure. There's massive changes in our economy, in our communities. And so there needs to be ways for us to address that. And these technologies may offer some opportunities for intervention that allows us to sort of relieve some of those challenges. It has to be done well, though. And I think to get to the question around how can we ensure that communities understand where and how AI is being used, I'll reference a bit of the work that we've just done on statutory planning. So a system that is under a huge amount of pressure. There's a very significant demand on housing provision, and councils sit in that space of authorising planning applications to deliver a lot of that housing. We were very lucky to be funded by the National Housing Task Force at a federal level to partner with the City of Greater Dandenong to do this piece of work to look at where AI and automation may play a role in supporting that statutory planning process. And we made a really intentional decision to develop this work in as deep collaboration as we were able to. So we went out, we spoke with 70% of councils in the state, close to 250 people, as I mentioned, across council, the sector, applicants, community. And one of the really kind of critical insights from that work is this need for councils to engage in this work in a way that really considers and preserves the role of public value and the role of planners and the consideration that they have in this work, which is really about conserving and protecting community and the values of community and ensuring that development is in line with the values of community. And so I think that taking a really considered approach to this work, making sure that it's done in a transparent way and in dialogue with community so that our institutions and our community are acting on one another in developing the governance of these technologies is the critical path.
Thank you. We're going to open it up to questions from the floor now. I haven't seen any come through the chat, but please, hopefully they've just been percolating in your minds and you're getting ready to type those in. Please do use the chat function and state your name and your company before asking your question. If you would like to pose an anonymous question, you can also privately message it to Tess Kidman, who will then pass that on to me and I'll read it out without any descriptors of you. I'm enjoying all the words that I'm learning, all these the clanker from you, Van. I hadn't actually heard that before. So AI generated pieces of easy to identify. I appreciate this quote, Bonnie. We act on one another. Authenticity, TBC. And I also like I'm not sure if this was a slip of the tongue, Harman, but when you said seeing is believing, which I feel like in the context of this conversation is so entirely at the crux of the issue, when seeing is entirely no longer believing, and when so many local governments are actually being faced with disinformation campaigns that have elected representatives depicted saying or doing things that they have not. And so actually helping communities to understand what is happening and to find effective and transparent and trusted ways of engaging with that is harder than it ever has been. Okay, so I have a question here. I might pass this one to Harman, actually, from a smart cities perspective, if you feel comfortable with it. Can you give us a good example of an Australian local government that has implemented AI in any form?
Definitely. So look, let me just quickly clarify smart cities first of all. I should have done this before, but just base level setting. I know it's sometimes difficult to think of which is a smart city or whether or not we live in a smart city. So smart city is a transitory term, just like smartphones. If I were to pull up this phone maybe 2 decades ago and ask what it is, people would say you're holding a smartphone. Today, it's just a phone. Similarly, smart cities would eventually become cities, and all cities have to leverage technology and data for the good of citizens. So that's the crux of the smart city definition. Data for example of who all are using this in the space? Well, I think quite a few. So I live in Southeast Melbourne. I'm going to take the example of City of Casey. So City of Casey is starting to conduct AI literacy campaigns. Again, sometimes it's not about just, coming out with doing something around AI and then showing it off. Sometimes it's about, getting everyone along with you, make sure they are informed about what we are trying to do. So they have this model of what they call living labs. Living labs is a concept that comes from innovation world, which is about, small is the new big, doing things at a small scale first in a controlled environment, getting a few citizens alongside you, your communities alongside you, and then co-developing, co-creating whatever you want to develop on. So they have been using this concept of living labs to actually come up with suggestions about how they could use AI to, improve the quality of life. One of the good examples is around what City of Casey has built up as the foundation for AI use. It's called Open Data Platform. A lot of councils have actually done this. Basically, what they have done is they have democratized all the data that they have, whether it's around building permits, whether it's around different assets, the lighting poles, whatever, furniture, wherever it is, lying parks, blah, blah. So all those data sets have been democratized. It's available on the open data that anyone can look up and check. And what the city is encouraging is people to go out and leverage that data to start developing their own apps, applications on mobiles and all. So that's another good example of, someone who is preparing an AI strong foundation for its citizens to continue building upon it. The last thing I would say about that council, and by the way, others are also but I think the other key subtle factor I want to talk about when it comes to leveraging AI to manage misinformation and all that disconnects that sometimes councils have with their communities, the good old saying from where I come from, north of India, is the key that locks the door is the same key that will open it. If AI is becoming a tool for spreading misinformation and all, AI is going to be the same tool that will help us sometimes avoid or stop that misinformation. So Ika, that seeing is believing. If actually things are not exactly what they look like, then we will use still AI to offset or to overcome any kind of distortion noise that would have entered the space.
Absolutely. Thank you. I mean, we're in that space where we're trying to maximize those constructive, trustworthy, and hopefully democracy strengthening applications of AI whilst minimizing those nuisance and harmful uses. We've got a question from Gia at City of Gosnells. Do you think AI is at the peak of inflated expectations and will be a while until it reaches plateau of productivity, as Gartner hype cycle suggests? I'll hand that one to you, Van.
I certainly think that there's a lot of hype around AI, which is being driven by market valuations. Obviously, it's in the interests of people like Sam Altman and Elon Musk to say this will solve all problems and this is the future, because it drives up their stock price, not based on what they can do now, but what they're promising. And I certainly think that I think recent political decisions made in the United States have been interesting, that originally in Trump's big, beautiful bill, they weren't going to allow regulation of AI. They did apparently pause on that particular provision because there are serious concerns about how successful it's going to be. Obviously, as the introduction of a new technology, there are very complex risk matrices around the employment between there are complex risk matrices around the use of AI that even massive investors and that are, for example, private equity, superannuation funds, anybody who's in this investment space are still developing the risk matrices around putting money into AI. And there is very much a sandbox mentality about seeing how this will go what potential risks and gains there may be, but we're sort of trapped in a moment where the hype is enormous. There is a great race towards the technology while we're in this sort of delayed reaction around regulation, which obviously corporations are taking advantage of. But I think that there are places where there are reservations, which is having an impact on what our understanding of the potential of the technology might be and how value it may be. But we are very much in a liminal space. And I wanted to address, as part of that answer, the question that came up from the City of Joondalup as well, like what can we do? Well, I think as local government associations, you work out what your ethical frameworks are, what ethical frameworks you're currently using, not just in terms of council policy, respectful integration with communities, an understanding of bias, commitment to accessible service provision, and the frameworks you already use to make those decisions, as well as looking at your relationships with trade unions and staff representation and the legal frameworks by which you honour your service commitments, as well as the way that you treat staff. And you employ a project manager. Project management and leadership from onset decisions around what you actually want to achieve and how you currently govern your own decisions and what your priorities are is the way that you begin a framework of using the technology. And in regards to Harmon and I are sort of talking about slightly different things, where he's talking about the capacity of AI to do things that humans can't do. And I'm talking about the capacity of AI to sub humans out of what they already do. And of course, the negotiation is that if there's not a person who can fact check and interrogate what the technology is telling you to do, it's dangerous. And that has to be part of the risk assessment you make and the decisions you make around, because the consequences are potentially disastrous.
It's very true. In terms of the examples of what should be included in these governance frameworks and things like that, there are some great policy examples globally as well. City of San Jose established a network of different local governments looking at responsible and ethical use of AI in local government. Likewise, City of Boston is doing some great work, and of course, Bonnie Shaw and team at Municipal Association of Victoria. And Bonnie, I'm going to throw this one to you from Erin Ruff at Flinders University in South Australia. How can universities best support local government with AI issues? Is it access to research, collaborative research, student projects, graduate skills? What's most useful in that exchange?
All of the above. So one of the first things the MAV Lab did when we were established was reach out to a number of the universities in Victoria to establish MOUs for ongoing collaboration. And so it's a really big focus for us to be able to access and leverage the skills and insights of the universities, their academics, the passion and new thinking from the students, but then also try and provide pathways to connect local governments with some of that work and those people. It's a tough job, and like Ika, I also hold a position as a professor at RMIT, and so navigating the ecosystems of many local governments and the large university institutions are, it's pretty challenging. And so we're still sort of in the process of working out how to best do that in a way that works in some efficient way. But I think finding those opportunities to connect sort of rigorous new thinking into some of these institutions is really critical. The work of the Innovation Lab is to bring new perspectives and to challenge existing ways of working and thinking. And so finding ways that help us sort of be provocative is really critical. So those university partnerships are really important. I did also just, if I can just touch on the ethics piece, it's one of the critical recommendations that came out of the initial reporting that we did around the statutory planning work, and building on Van's comment absolutely reference the ethical and practice frameworks of the public service is the starting point that we see. But I go back to that comment of acting on one another, being in dialogue. Ethics practice is not something that you kind of write down into a document and then sort of wash your hands of. And so off the back of this first phase of work, we've now moved into a second phase around establishing a roadmap for delivery and implementation for AI in local governments in Victoria. The first thing we did as part of that was open up an EOI for a task force, so to people working in local government and for people working across the sector. And that will be kicking off any day now. And one of the areas that a lot of people have expressed interest in participating in and helping to shape is a sort of ethics-based community of practice. So a way of bringing challenge and these kind of care questions to a forum for discussion. And so this idea that our democracy works through dialogue and conversation, but it also works through action. So how do we kind of have these conversations, test and learn in kind of forums that allow us the freedom to grow, but hopefully manage some of the risks as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Bonnie. I feel like you've all given us a huge amount of food for thought. We're going to draw the conversation to a close now, but thank you for this very timely conversation. I have a particular interest in this. I was fortunate to be the lead author of the world's first Disinformation in the City response playbook last year, where we talked about things like, institutional trust, the trusted places, people, and transparency and competence and consistency in local governance in being able to regenerate trust amongst the community. You've spoken about a huge number of very complex things today, and I've gained a lot from this conversation. I trust that this has also been of interest and insightful for others here today. So thank you very much to our panelists for sharing your insights and your wealth of knowledge on this topic. And thank you to our audience for being here. And I'll hand back to you now, Sharon.
Thank you everyone for a fascinating and wide-ranging discussion. And thank you to the attendees who popped some questions into the chat. I'm sorry we didn't get to the final, but I really appreciate your participation. Ben, Bonnie and Harmon, please accept my sincere thanks for joining us today, for your contribution in developing and driving the discussion, and Eka for so expertly facilitating the conversation. Thank you again also to the Municipal Association of Victoria for your ongoing support, and particularly to Sean Rogash. I'm not sure if Sean is online, but I've really enjoyed working closely with Sean in designing the conversation. For all of our attendees, we'll be sending a post-event email out in the next couple of days, and that'll include the recording. So if you can go back and review any part of it that you like, and that email will also include additional content that you might find useful. Finally, just a shout out to a couple of upcoming events that people might be interested in. On the 9th of September, we have a live on global perspectives on the future of international students in Australia. That discussion will include a speaker, the President and CEO of Universities of Canada, Gabriel Miller. So we encourage you to jump online and register for that. That is free for members, and there's a small fee for non-members. And the other one that will be of particular interest is CEDA's annual AI Leadership Conference, which is taking place in Brisbane on the 21st and 22nd of October. The conference has sold out over the last 2 years, and it brings together local and international decision makers and those immersed in AI for in-depth conversations exploring productivity and strategic innovation, the skills revolution, and preparing for the AI economy. The conference will also be live streamed, and registration for that will open up closer to the date. But if you're in Brisbane at the time, jump online and have a look at the program. Thank you, everybody, again. I hope you all have a great afternoon.